It's a historic security partnership. The US, UK, and Australia form a new military pact in the Indo-Pacific. Their leaders say it will build peace and stability in the region, but opponents argue it harms other relationships and escalates tensions. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the AUKUS alliance. Well, it may sound awkward, but it is the perfect acronym for its three partners. AUKUS is a joint defense agreement ostensibly aimed at countering China's growing influence in the Indo-Pacific region. At the core of the pact, Australia will build nuclear-powered submarines using American and British technology. The initiative, of course, has its critics, especially among those who fear a military escalation in the region alongside rising U.S. influence. But the leaders of all three AUKUS nations say those fears are unfounded, and the pact instead will help bring stability with no threat from actual nuclear weapons.
Today, we're taking another historic step to deepen and formalize cooperation among all three of our nations, because we all recognize the imperative of ensuring peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific over the long term.
We're opening a new chapter in our friendship, and the first task of this partnership will be to help Australia acquire a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines, emphasizing, of course, that the submarines in question will be powered by nuclear reactors, not armed with nuclear weapons. And our work will be fully in line with our non-proliferation obligations.
We intend to build these submarines in Adelaide, Australia, in close cooperation with the United Kingdom and the United States. But let me be clear, Australia is not seeking to acquire nuclear weapons or establish a civil nuclear capability.
While neither Biden, Johnson, nor Morrison referred to China directly, their partnership is widely seen as a means to push back against Beijing's increasing strength in the region. China has been accused of raising tensions and militarizing the South China Sea. Australia and China were once each other's top trade partners, but that relationship has broken down in the past few years. And according to Beijing, the AUKUS alliance will only make things worse.
The US, UK, and Australia are engaging in cooperation on nuclear-powered armaments that gravely undermines regional peace and stability, aggravates the arms race, and hurts international non-proliferation efforts.
And then there's France, who lost a multi-billion-dollar defense contract to the AUKUS Pact. Australia scrapped a pre-existing deal with Paris to build diesel-fueled submarines. Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian says France is furious. He described the move as a betrayal and says there will be a price to pay.
C'est vraiment en bon français un coup dans le dos.
It's really a stab in the back. We built a relationship of trust with Australia, and this trust was betrayed, and I'm angry today with a lot of bitterness about this breach of contract. This is not done between allies, especially when there's been 2 years of negotiations for this contract.
And Australia building its own nuclear-powered submarines has also raised concerns about a wider problem: global nuclear proliferation. Some believe the pact will harm efforts to keep the planet safe from nuclear technology. And New Zealand, Australia's neighbor and key ally, is not happy with the idea of those submarines near its territorial waters, especially with Wellington's long-standing nuclear-free policy.
I anticipate absolutely no change in our already strong relationship with the United States, the UK, and of course Australia. On the first question, no, we weren't approached, but nor would I expect us to be. The centrepiece of this arrangement is the building of nuclear-powered submarines to be based out of Australia. And Prime Minister Morrison, and indeed all partners, are very well versed and understand our position on nuclear-powered vessels and also nuclear weapons. That, of course, means that they well understood our likely position on the establishment of nuclear-powered submarines and their use in the region.
So, with all its controversy, is the AUKUS Pact a net positive or a risk for peace and security? Joining me now to discuss that from Canberra is John Blaxland, a professor of international security and intelligence studies at the Australian National University. From Beijing is Qinduo. He is a China affairs analyst and senior fellow at the Pangual Institution, a Beijing-based public policy think tank. And from London, Paul Ingram, an expert on nuclear disarmament and the director of Emergent Change. Thanks all so much for being with us. John, I'm going to start with you. You know, if it is really all about countering China's growing military presence and influence in the Indo-Pacific, is this a necessary, proactive strategy that, you know, as all three leaders profess, will bring greater peace and security?
So, yes, thanks, Andrea, for having me on the program. I guess it's a bit of a gamble, isn't it, really? It's a calculated risk that the strategy that's been followed so far hasn't been working and that they need to dump it and start something fresh. The great irony is, of course, that we had this deal with the French Naval Group to manufacture submarines that were a derivative of a nuclear-propelled submarine, for which we had asked them to take the nuclear propulsion out and put in a diesel-electric engine instead. So Australia has been chopping and changing its positions, and that's not made things easier. But, you know, as they say in that the wonderful, fairy tale that the kids often read, the story is that, you know, if that's where you wanted to go, I wouldn't start from here. Now, that's all well and good, but this is where we are. And what we're facing is a situation where, you know, China has become much more assertive in its language and in its actions. And as a former military intelligence analyst, I can tell you that what I've looked at in the past is the issue of capability and intent. And capability-wise, China is building nuclear submarines like they're going out of fashion, and building hypersonic weapons and DF-21 aircraft killers and things like that, which is all on an incredibly steep trajectory of growth. That's coupled with rhetorical, superlatives that are threatening attack on Australia, that are about what we call wolf warrior diplomacy and the exercise of sharp power, sanctions against us, sanctions against the Koreans, overflights over the Japanese and, of course, the Taiwanese, let alone half a dozen other countries. So the combination of all those factors is contributing to this turnaround in Australia.
Okay, but it seems like summing it up, you kind of describe it as what could be a necessary evil. Let me ask Zhu Qinduo, though. You believe the alliance, in large part because of those nuclear-powered submarines, actually leaves Australia more vulnerable, in greater danger, rather than being better protected?
I would say it could be, certainly, because, you know, when you are dealing with the situation kind of like being confrontational, remember, you take a step and the competitor will take another step to ensure they have their own security, remember. I wouldn't say China is alarmed by this, latest move for Australia to get this nuclear-powered submarine. Because for China, of course, in terms of military capabilities, it's really about being defensive, because China is one of the only 5 UN Security Council permanent members that is still to gain reunification, territorial integrity, and sovereignty issue. So no, yes, China is fully capable of protecting itself to defend its interests, even though Australia will have this nuclear-powered submarines, right? So it's not, but remember, I mean, if Australia continue to, present this kind of hostility toward China, for example, remember Australia is the first country to kick Chinese company Huawei out of its 5G network. That's not friendly, remember. And so China has all the means to target Australia if necessary, I would say. Remember, China is a nuclear power. We remember. I mean, Australia and the UK and the US can do what they think they need to do. And the Chinese side, for example, probably they will do what they think they need to do to protect their interests. In that situation, will Australia become more secure or less secure?
Okay, let me ask.
Well, it's probably going to be less secure because we're facing a remarkable spike in Chinese investment in military capabilities. They're building offensive weapons. That this is happening in response to years, the last decade or two, of incredible military spending, incredible capability growth, and rhetorical barbs being flung left, front, and centre. It's not happening in a vacuum. And it's not being initiated from Canberra. It is in direct response to quite assertive, acerbic, aggressive action and rhetoric. Capability and intent. You do the math and you recognise you've got to do something about it.
Okay.
So this is not an unreasonable response.
I do want to bring Paul into this, Drew. I can imagine you do have a response, but yeah, it sounds from either side that one's saying you started it, the other saying, no, you started it. But let me ask Paul if you think this is a necessary evil needed for protection, or is it a provocation that could actually increase vulnerability of Australia in particular in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I think as with most issues in international security, it's both. I think it's understandable that Australia may be feeling more vulnerable because of the developments that we've seen. It's also deeply understandable that the Chinese feel that they need to be more assertive in the world, given their experience over the last 100 or 200 years, and the way in which they've been treated by other states. I don't think it really helps to see this from a particular perspective. Rather, we need to see this from a multitude of perspectives and think about how, rather than ganging up against our adversaries, we can actually invite those adversaries into more common security arrangements. I've seen no evidence of any effort by any of the actors, the Chinese, the Australians, the British, or the Americans, to really reach out and have a greater understanding of the perspectives of the other. What we've seen is over-reliance on military technologies, and here today we see an extraordinary break from previous practice, where the only other situation where a country has shared its nuclear propulsion technology has been the Americans and the British, and now those two countries are sharing it with Australia. No other country has ever shared nuclear propulsion technology, because nuclear propulsion technology is pretty much the crown jewels of any navy. More so even than the
it's more than
design of
that, mate. It's the nuclear weapons on board, and we're not taking them. I take issue with what you're saying, Paul, because really, I mean, this is not happening in a vacuum. Australia has only recently, in response to a much more assertive and acerbic presidency under President Xi, responded in this way. Australia for a long time has been very, very supportive of China, been very actively engaged in constructively looking to build ties with China. And what we found is we've had direct interference, we've had cyber attacks, we've had trade sanctions, we've had a range of really quite assertive and hostile actions taken against Australia, and they have not been initiated by Australia. We've responded
I hear you, but
to.
the Chinese are not the only ones that engage in such tactics. We've seen exactly the similar type of tactics from the Americans, from the British, and from other states. The Chinese are often have the finger pointed at them, and I understand why you do that, because there are certainly reprehensible behaviours on the part of Beijing, but they are far from alone.
It's good of you to recognise that.
Okay, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
Right, I'd like to give Zhu Qinduo. I promised him a chance to respond earlier. So, Zhu Qinduo, go ahead.
Yeah, if you look at the situation when people talk about, they are talking about the Chinese territories. They talk about China's Taiwan, or Hong Kong, or Xinjiang, or close to China, like South China Sea. Yes, there are disputes between China and Vietnam, between Vietnam and Malaysia, between Malaysia and the Philippines. These issues should be resolved by the regional countries, including China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, for example. It has little to do with the United States, remember, and it has nothing to do with Australia. And we are not talking about any dangerous waters surrounding Australia or surrounding the United States. Remember which side is aggressive. They are trying to dictate how China should achieve its reunification with Taiwan. And remember, China is Australia's largest trading partner, and China never sees Australia as a threat because it's far away. People see Australia as a place, for further education, for tourism, for investment, for immigration. No, Australia is not the threat to China. So China has no intention to, for example, interfere with its internal affairs. Frankly speaking,
but you already do. You do
Australia
interfere.
is not, in that sense, that carries that much weight to China as for China to interfere. Remember Chinese foreign policy, one of the most important principles is non-interference of the internal affairs of another country.
Okay.
China does not have
we all
any
love a
interest
good
in
set of double
Australia's
standards,
affairs.
Stu. We all have a good set of double standards, and I admit Australia's up there. Every country loves to hold other countries to different standards, and I acknowledge that, and I think you should too. I mean, let's be frank. Every country looks after its interests as best it can, but Australia is not a threat to China. Us acquiring 8 potentially nuclear-propelled submarines in the next 2 decades is not a threat to China. What is a threat is China's really upsetting of the apple cart, not really being prepared to make a deal with the Southeast Asian countries over the so-called Code of Conduct and the declaration of the Code of Conduct. You've spent 20 years arguing with Southeast Asia, deliberately obfuscating and delaying. You've overthrown the rules about the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. You've built artificial islands. You've played the we're big, you're small, so please behave.
Do you also acknowledge, for example, you mentioned about building these artificial islands. Do you also acknowledge it's not only China, actually other countries did that way earlier than China?
But on a way smaller
every
scale,
country involved in that kind of activity to strengthen their presence in the islands under their control. So that's why we have a dispute. And as for CDC, that's the ASEAN way. For the ASEAN way of resolving issues, it takes time, it takes patience.
Okay.
I'd
like to bring Paul, I want to give everybody equal time, as you know, and I'd like to bring Paul back into the discussion because we often hear, Paul, China invoke this argument that this is our backyard, it is our region, it's an issue of our sovereignty, and there is no right
That's
for a
not how the
country
Malaysians or the
Hold on.
Vietnamese or the
I
Filipinos
know. Let me finish this question with Paul, please. They will often argue that this is the Chinese stance here. But let's be honest, we are all in a global environment together, and everyone can argue that they have interests in every region around the world somehow, and they have the right to be involved in whatever way they see fit. So given the global security dynamics, I mean, watching all these arsenals continually building, be it submarines, be it nuclear weapons in certain cases, what will actually deter all parties now from entering military conflict if they are going to continue with the rhetoric and the constant investment and building of these massive weapons arsenals?
Well, so I'm not condemning anybody for investing in weapons because that would be far too idealistic. But what we have to do is not just invest in weapon systems, but we have to be actually having a conversation about the principles underlying it. And I think underlying our relationships with the rest of the world. Now, we've just heard the very strong Chinese perspective that sovereignty is absolute. And that is not realistic in the 21st century. We do have an interest in everybody else, but at the same time, we exist in an international community of sovereign states. So we have to have an open conversation here that is cross-cultural, with respect, understanding each other's perspectives. Now, human rights are very important. But the West often uses human rights as a way of using them as a stick against countries that they don't like. We need to be more principled in the way we have these conversations about human rights. There are Chinese perspectives around human rights as well that deserve conversation and deserve hearing. But we need to be working towards an international community that revisits the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with an open mind and actually says, hey, let's review where we are with this and let's open up our borders.
Paul, very
because
quickly,
we agreed in 46 that our borders were not sacrosanct.
Paul, very quickly, what do you say to the critics that accuse you and people that share are like-minded of being naive?
Yeah, well, I accept that I'm naive in the sense that I am looking for answers outside of the usual mainstream responses that lead us into arms races and war. War is a state of situation between states that has been going on for decades and centuries, but it doesn't have to be like that. I've spent my life looking at different alternative ways of responding to other countries. And I'm not saying I've got the answers. I'm not saying that there's a magic wand we can wave to escape these problems, but we do have to recognize that we are in problems, and the Chinese have responded with having nuclear weapons to the West's acquisition of nuclear weapons, and we're no safer as a result. I don't point the finger of blame at the Chinese in that respect, but I do think that we, all of us, wherever we were in initiating this problem, have a responsibility to provide ladders out of the traps that we're in. And that requires us to actually consider this from each other's perspective.
Fair enough. John and Qinduo, I'm going to focus the last 5 minutes on the two of you. And let me start with John, though, because we need to talk about some other issues at play here. First of all, what Australia has done in kind of alienating some of its allies and friends, starting with New Zealand, that does not like that their national policy is non-nuclear, and now they're going to have nuclear-powered submarines right on their territorial borders. Then there's also France, you know, who's furious about having spent billions of dollars, I mean, investing in a multi-billion-dollar contract for 5 years of efforts just to have it thrown in the waste bin and handed over to the Americans. Is it good for Australia, the US, and the UK to alienate a European ally like that?
Look, I think it was clod-hopping behaviour. I don't think it was sensible at all, and I think it's a great shame that this has eventuated. France has actually been acting in good faith. It's been endeavouring to engage in the Indo-Pacific, in part because it's got territories there that adjoin Australia's exclusive economic zones in the Pacific. And we have an interest in making the relationship with France work. It's important. The same goes for New Zealand, but even more so with New Zealand. Australia and New Zealand are really important partners in the Pacific. We've actually been instrumental together in addressing security challenges in the Pacific, particularly in Bougainville, in East Timor, in Solomon Islands, and other places. We work best when we work together. So this, dare I say, fracture between Australia and New Zealand is deeply worrying. But of course, it's very interesting that Jacinda Ardern has chosen to use the words she has, because this is a position that New Zealand took 35 years ago, when David Lange was Prime Minister of New Zealand and effectively triggered the abrogation of the ANZUS Treaty over the demand that the Americans declare whether they had nuclear weapons on board. Now, the Americans were never wanting to do that. Now, Australia doesn't have nuclear weapons, so this is a position that I think is a little bit getting back at Australia for having been hard on New Zealand on a couple of other policy issues. And I'm hoping that over in the near future, this will be resolved, because Australia and New Zealand have enormous interests they have in common, and overlapping interests are really critical here as we think about the future challenges. One of the other things, of course, to note is, of course, Australia provides for a lot of the security that makes New Zealand happy to have a nuclear-free policy in the first place.
It looks like we just lost Qinduo, but now it seems we have Qinduo back, albeit with a different background. But Qinduo, I'm going to wrap up with you. Thanks so much for sticking around. Final question then. What do you think China will actually do next? Will the country have to take the harder line if it sees fit, as per the military escalation we've been seeing now? Or could Beijing simply reflect on lines which we just heard from London there and from Paul, and look more pragmatically at diplomatic efforts to try and realign, get back the healthy relationship it had just a few years ago with Australia and with much of the rest of the world?
Well, if you look at the past couple of years, in particular at the last couple of years of Trump administration, remember which country launched this trade war in the first place, which country imposed sanctions, imposed, for example, this restrictive measures on on the selling of the components, for example, semiconductors to Chinese companies. Which country is pressuring its allies not to use the Chinese technology, Huawei in particular, a Chinese company? So it's really, if you say you call it competition or you call it Cold War, it started from Washington. And now you have a Biden administration. Basically, we are seeing a continuation of that kind of policy. What do you expect the Chinese side to do and to resolve this issue? It's really about, when Biden was elected president, everybody was waiting, there will be a change of a policy. For example, the tariffs on the products and services from the Chinese side, because it's not only hurting the Chinese companies, but also it's hurting the US consumers. I think Washington, as well as Canberra, Australia, they should do something to improve the situation. Of course, the Chinese side will respond positively, I believe.
Okay. China has said, though, that, we're seeing the Cold War mentality and ideological prejudice raising its ugly head. We'll have to see how things develop from here, but unfortunately we're out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and to our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.